everyone, welcome to class. My name is Jane and I teach SAT at Makers Academy. So today we are going to walk through a focused set of practice questions together so you can start thinking the way SAT expects you to think. In this sample lecture, we'll be covering 3 reading questions, 3 grammar questions, 1 transition question, and 1 rhetorical synthesis question. So feel free to actively engage as you're watching this video. Think through each question before I discuss it, and don't worry if you get something wrong. This is exactly where mistakes are most valuable because they will show us what to fix. So all right, let's get started with our first reading question. So you can either pause and try to solve it before you listen to me explain, but I'll be reading the question out loud. In humans, the plyometer reflex triggers what is commonly recognized as goosebumps, a response generally viewed as vestigial, meaning it once conferred a biological benefit that no longer applies today. This reflex is activated when a small muscle attached to each hair follicle contracts, causing the hair to stand erect. In animals possessing feathers, fur, or quills, this action provides either thermal insulation or visual deterrent to predators. However, because human hair lacks sufficient density, it no longer fulfills these protective or insulating roles. Nevertheless, goosebumps in humans may have evolved a secondary function. Similar to skin flushing, which also serves thermoregulatory purposes, goosebumps have become associated with emotional experiences, particularly fear, anger, or aesthetic pleasure such as that evoked by music. Consequently, these reactions may now serve a communicative or social signaling purpose. And the question we have here is, which choice best describes the function of the underlined sentence in the text as a whole? So to briefly summarize the passage is explaining that goosebumps were once useful in animals for insulation or defense purposes, but are now largely vestigial in humans. However, they may have developed a secondary function being linked to emotional experiences, like when you're listening to really good music, you get goosebumps all over, and possibly serving a social or communicative role. So because this is a function question, you must identify what the underlying sentence is doing in context. So the focus isn't completely on what it says. We have to identify the function of what this underlying sentence is doing. So here, similar to skin flushing, which also serves thermoregulatory purposes, goosebumps have become associated with emotional experiences, particularly fear, anger, or aesthetic pleasure, such as that evoked by music. So the key focus here would be, number 1, we have to pay attention to where the sentence appears, what it connects, and its role in the argument. So when we take that into consideration, it comes after introducing that it has evolved to have a secondary function, and then it connects. It introduces that it is similar to skin flushing, but ultimately what it's saying is that goosebumps have become associated with emotional experiences. So its role in the argument would be bridging biology with emotional and social explanation. So it helps explain why goosebumps are connected to emotions, is what this sentence is doing. So let's take a look at answer choices. A, it describes the role of goosebumps within the body's thermoregulatory processes, drawing a parallel to the function of skin flushing. So this is talking about the thermoregulation comparison with skin flushing, which is definitely something that is mentioned here, especially in this part. But the underlying sentence is not mainly about temperature control. It uses skin flushing only as a comparison. Skin flushing is when you're blushing. So when you're blushing, it could be number 1, because it's really hot, right? That would be thermoregulatory. But you could blush when it's cool, when you're embarrassed, or when you are shy, or anything else. So it also has an emotional reaction to it. So this part, the part where I highlighted yellow, it is using skin flushing only as a comparison. So to say that we are describing the role of goosebumps, drawing a parallel to this wouldn't be the main purpose of what the underlying part is doing. So A would ultimately be incorrect. B, it addresses and clarifies a widespread misunderstanding regarding the function of goosebumps in humans. So B is claiming that it corrects a misunderstanding. but the passage never mentions a misconception or a debate of any sort. It is building an explanation, not correcting anything. So B would be incorrect. C, it explores potential explanation for the relationship between emotional states and the appearance of goosebumps in humans. This is correct. It accurately states the function. It is explaining the link between emotions and goosebumps. So when we look at this, similar to skin flushing, this is just an introductory clause to the main clause that we want to say. It has been associated with emotional experiences such as fear, anger, or aesthetic pleasure, right? So potential explanation between emotional states and appearance of goosebumps in humans. This matches the passage shift to secondary function of emotional and social role perfectly. It explains the link between emotions and goosebumps. So C would be the right answer. Let's take a look at D. It proposes that both skin flushing and goosebumps reflect identical emotional experiences. So D is saying that both reactions show identical emotional experiences, but the passage never claims that they're identical. So identical would be way too strong to represent similar. And this is, we don't do that in SATs. When something is too extreme, we know that it is an incorrect option. So being similar and being identical are two different things. So D would be too extreme to represent what the underlying part was. So overall, C becomes the right answer. Now we're going to move on to our next question. So this is a main idea question, meaning that we would have to read this passage and basically a simple summary would be a main idea, right? So the following text is adapted from Frederick Douglass's 1852 speech. Frederick Douglass was a former slave and a leading abolitionist. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could I reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened, the conscience of a nation must be roused, the propriety of a nation must be startled, the hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and men must be denounced. So, to briefly summarize what has been, what I just read, this is an excerpt from Frederick Douglass's speech, and Douglass argues that calm reasoning is no longer enough. Instead, the nation would need intense, forceful criticism to awaken its conscience and confront the injustice of slavery. And he uses a lot of repetition, right? So what to focus on here is, this is a main idea question. So we have to focus on number 1, the overall tone. Number 2, the purpose. And number 3, repeated ideas. So the purpose here would be to awaken and to shock the nation into action. And repeated ideas would be something like, this is not, we don't need a light, but we need a fire. It's not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind and earthquake. So all of these, he is really trying to intensely awaken the public's conscience and confront them to admit how slavery is such an injustice to the people who are involved in it. So looking at this, let's look at A. Speaker delivers a vehement critique of the nation's moral duplicity regarding the institution of slavery. So A seems very, very valid, but it is focusing only on the critique of hypocrisy, which is part of the message, but not the whole point. It is, what he is doing is he is critiquing the public, but he's also emphasizing them and like calling them out, like saying that this is really urgent and we have to be awakened to how urgent this is. So A would be missing the emphasis on urgency and awakening. So this is a very valid point in addressing the hypocrisy part, but it isn't the main idea because it's not as comprehensive. So A would be incorrect. B, the speaker involves theological rhetoric to instill a sense of spiritual culpability in the audience. So B is mentioning a theological rhetoric. So yes, religion is referenced here. God and men. He is mentioning God, but that isn't the main idea. The focus is much broader. We have to address the moral awakening, not the religion itself. So B would be an incorrect answer by focusing too much on a little detail that was mentioned, hence can't be a main idea. C, the speaker advocates for an urgent and unrestrained moral reckoning aimed at awakening the public's conscience to systematic injustice. So C is correct because it's capturing all the key elements. Number one, the urgency. Number two, the purpose of awakening the public, and the scope of what he is addressing, the systematic injustice of slavery, right? So this matches the passage's intensity, call to action, what it is criticizing. Everything is comprehensively mentioned in C, making C the right answer. Now let's take a look at D. The speaker laments his perceived inability to influence national discourse due to his racial and social status. So D is saying that he is lamenting his inability to influence. So yes, over here, oh, had I the ability and could I reach the nation's ear, I would today pour blah, blah, blah. This does seem like he is kind of lamenting how he doesn't have the ability to reach the ear, but that isn't the main focus over here. He's not complaining. He is demanding a stronger action. The tone here is powerful. It's not defeated. He is saying he is addressing how he doesn't currently have that ability and how he wishes that he would have had it. But to say that that is the overall main idea wouldn't be accurate in representing what he is addressing in this passage as a whole. So again, D is only part, a detail of the overall message. So C becomes the right answer. Now we're going to move on to next question. This is our last reading question. So in the Southern Hemisphere, midwinter occurs during the months of June and July, while midsummer aligns with December. The onset of spring falls within August and September, and autumn emerges during February and March. In contrast to Northern Hemisphere, where the disparity between the extremes of midsummer heat and midwinter cold is somewhat mitigated by the Earth's varying solar distance throughout the year, this solar distance effect is accentuated in the Southern Hemisphere due to the Earth's reaching perihelion, its closest orbital point to the Sun, during the height of the southern summer. Nonetheless, because the Earth travels more rapidly in its orbit from October to March than from April to September, the southern summer is sufficiently abbreviated to counterbalance the increased solar proximity, resulting in a thermal experience that remains roughly equivalent to that of the northern hemisphere's summer. So this is a really long passage, so let's take a look at question. Based on the passage, which statement best explains why summer in the southern hemisphere is not significantly hotter than summer in the northern hemisphere, despite the Earth being closer to the sun during that time? So this is a detailed question. How do we know if a question is a detailed question? So what we do is if we try to apply the same question to a different passage, it wouldn't work because the question is referring to specific information within this passage, right? So in comparison to which choice best describes the main idea of the text, this question can apply to numerous different passages, whereas we know for a fact that this question can only be referring to this specific passage because it is addressing the information that only this passage is addressing. That's how we know if a question is a detailed question. So a good news that we have about detailed question is that no matter how difficult or long a passage is, as long as you identify the exact lines in the question is referring to, the correct answer will always be a paraphrased version of that part of the text. So we have to explain why summer in southern hemisphere is not significantly hotter than summer in the northern hemisphere. So looking at this passage, we would have to look for the exact sentence that compares southern hemisphere and northern hemisphere summer and compares the heat of each hemisphere, right? So here, if we take a look, because Earth travels more rapidly in its orbit from October to March than from April to September, the southern summer is sufficiently abbreviated to counterbalance the increased solar proximity, resulting in a thermal experience that remains roughly equivalent to that of Northern Hemisphere summer. This part would be what we would have to look at to get the right answer. So the passage is explaining that although Southern Hemisphere is closer to the sun during the summer, it doesn't experience significantly hotter summers because the Earth moves faster in its orbit, making the southern summer shorter and ultimately balancing out the increased solar intensity. So that's all the information we have to know. Everything else is just like additional information that would have helped us to understand this part. But once we know what the question is asking and we identify which part of the passage is indeed addressing that, we just look for a paraphrased version of that, and that is the right answer. So yes, ultimately this part is saying yes, closer, but it is shorter, so that cancels out and ends up similar temperatures. So let's take a look at A. The southern hemisphere's greater proximity to the sun during midsummer causes the Earth to slow in its orbit, reducing the duration of summer. So A is saying that Earth slows down, which is opposite of what the passage is saying. Passage clearly says that Earth is moving more rapidly, so A would be incorrect because it's the opposite of what the underlined part is telling us. B, the Earth reaches its furthest point from the sun during northern midsummer, which lessens the severity of seasonal temperature changes. So B is talking about northern hemisphere's distance, and that's not the reason asked in the question. The focus is wrong in B. Furthest point, midsummer, lessens the severity of seasonal temperature changes. We're not focusing on seasonal temperature changes. We're trying to compare summers in northern and southern hemisphere, not the seasonal temperature changes. So the focus is off in B, making it wrong. C, the southern hemisphere summer is shorter due to the Earth's increased orbital speed, which offsets the intensified solar effect of being closer to the sun. This is correct. This matches the highlighted part exactly. Faster orbital speed, shorter summer, ultimately offsets increased solar intensity. All of that is accurately mentioned in C, making C the best option. So if you guys take a closer look at C and the highlighted version, you would see that it is like a summary or paraphrased of what the highlighted version is, and that's exactly what detailed questions are. Let's take a look at D. Seasonal temperature changes in the southern hemisphere are unaffected by Earth's distance from the sun due to atmospheric regulation. So D is saying that distance from sun has no effect, but the passage clearly says that it does have an effect, but is ultimately balanced. So this would be wrong interpretation of the passage. So we are done with the reading questions. Because this is like me showing you how to do it, I haven't given you guys any thinking time. So you guys would have had to pause in between to really think before you listen to my explanations and stuff. But hopefully, I hope this would have given you guys an idea of how to address each option according to the question and the passage. So now we are going to move on to the grammar questions that we have. So here, all of the grammar questions, we have to identify what set of grammar rules we have to address. So for this one, this concept finds its root in the works of ancient Greek historians Thucydides, who analyzed the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta and found a similar logic and relationship between rising and ruling powers. So here we have to, looking at A, B, C, and D, what we have to do is choose the right punctuation based on knowing what information is essential and non-essential. So we are given this information, Greek historian, this person, and who, blah, blah, blah. So this is what we have. So in English, this is layered essential and non-essential question. So whenever we want to determine whether or not something is essential or non-essential in SATs, we have to think of this in quantitative measures, not qualitative. So qualitative would be, oh, is this information important? That would be like a qualitative assessment. But we don't do that in SATs. We think quantitatively, is this cutting down the number? So think of the number of Greek historians out there. How many would there be? We don't know, but more than one for sure. So let's say that there are 100 Greek historians. And then to know that Thucydides, this is one person for sure, right? So we know for a fact that out of all the Greek historians, Thucydides would have the effect of cutting down the number, meaning that this is essential. So if it was flipped, saying that this concept finds its root in the work of Thucydides, an ancient Greek historian, it would start with one person, and knowing this information, ancient Greek historian, still would make it a one person because this would be an information of Thucydides, right? So that would be non-essential. But when we have the effect of cutting down how many of them there are, it would be an essential information, and we wouldn't want to add a comma. So it becomes like this. My name is Jane, as I've introduced. And if we say something like SAT instructor, Jane, how many SAT instructors are there in the world? So many. And knowing that Jane would be one person out of so many people out there, we know that it would definitely have the effect of cutting down the number. So this is essential. So we don't put any comma in here. So this has a comma. This also has a comma, so we don't want that, and that's how we know we eliminate B and D. And then there's another layer to it. Who analyzed the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta? So this is another information. So knowing that it is Thucydides, the information that he has analyzed Peloponnesian War, is this cutting down how many, the number of the historian that is introduced? No, this is still one. This would be an additional information that tells us what he has done. It doesn't have the effect of cutting down the number. So it becomes non-essential. And for a non-essential information, we want to separate it with a comma. So we want a comma here, making A the right answer. So this could be confusing if you haven't been exposed to the essential or non-essential rule, and this is the first time you are listening to me explaining this. But if this was a proper class, we would have had a proper section addressing the essential and non-essential rule beforehand. So just please keep that in mind. So for this question, you would have to know the essential and non-essential rule, how to quantitatively assess them. That if it cuts down the number, then it is essential. If it doesn't cut down the number of what it's describing, then it is non-essential. And this has a layer to it. Number one, we had to determine whether ancient Greek historians and Thucydides, whether this has cut the number. And number two, whether Thucydides and him analyzing Polynesian War cuts down the number. So from ancient Greek historian to Thucydides, yes, it cuts down the number, so it's essential. But here, it's still one person. This knowing that he has done this doesn't cut down this person from being 1 to 0. So it is non-essential. And that's why we don't want a comma here, but we want a comma here, making A the best answer. So next question. The Hopi, a Native American tribe renowned for its pottery and textiles, a deeply rooted cultural and spiritual connection to the land. So this is a subject-verb agreement. How do we know that? Because all the answer choices are about verb. So to determine the correct verb, you must identify the subject and its number, whether that subject is singular or plural. Here, a Native American tribe renowned for its pottery and textile, this would be an non-essential information describing what this tribe is, right? So ultimately, the subject would still be the Hopi, which is a singular collective noun. So we would want a singular verb. And we know that are, have, and have are all plural, making has the right answer. Another thing with subject-verb agreement questions is that when you look at the answer choice, When three of them are plural and only one is singular, it's kind of a giveaway that this one would be the right answer, and it would work other way too. If three of them are singular and only one of them is plural, we would know that the plural one has to be the right answer. So this is a hint that you could keep in mind to double check if what you have selected is the right answer. But ultimately, to properly address subject-verb agreement questions, you would have to correctly identify what the subject is. And here, it would be the hobby, which is a singular one. Yes. So our last grammar question, let's take a look. After an arduous journey through the mountains, the American expedition led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark reached the Pacific Ocean in 1806. For 18 months, they had traveled across uncharted lands, making meticulous notes on flora, fauna, and indigenous cultures they encountered. They expanded the United States' understanding of the Western territories. So here, this is a question about sentence boundaries. So once we have identified the sentence and its boundaries, we have to plug in the right punctuation to express that. So we have to look at the structure of the main ideas and their sentence structure presented. So we can just look at the sentence as the underlined part is over here, so we can ignore this part. For 18 months, they had traveled across uncharted lands, making meticulous notes on flora, fauna, and indigenous cultures they encountered. They expanded the United States' understanding of Western territories. So we know that they had traveled. This would be subject and verb. And another thing is they expanded. This is also a subject and verb. And what we know is that when there's subject verb and it is just connected with a comma or just no comma, it would be a run-on. So because of this information, we know that we have to separate this information here to separate this subject verb from being mashed to that the latter subject verb to prevent a run-on structure. So we would need a punctuation to end and properly separate these two subject verbs. So for 18 months, they had traveled across uncharted lands. This should be end of one sentence. Making meticulous notes on flora, fauna, and indigenous cultures they encountered, they expanded the United States. So that the structure here would be DC, comma, IC, full stop, DC, comma, IC, full stop. So making meticulous notes on flora, fauna, and indigenous cultures should be what is modifying this part of the sentence. So here we have to divide that. And the only option that correctly separates the two ideas would be C. So all the rest would be run-on structure. So you have to keep in mind that there are two distinct independent clauses. They must be separated by a terminal punctuation mark like a period or a semicolon. There is no option with a semicolon, meaning that C, the one with a period, has to be the right answer. Now we are going to look at one transition question. So philosopher Davis Chalmers, in his 1995 paper, introduces the concept of hard and easy problems in consciousness studies. The easy problems involve explaining cognitive functions such as memory and perception, while the hard problems involve explaining why and how we have subjective experiences. Chalmers argues that a hard problem can be explained solely in terms of objective explanation of the brain. Blank. He suggests that there is a subjective aspect of human consciousness that cannot be reduced to purely physical explanations. So this is saying that David Chalmers distinguishes between easy and hard problems of consciousness and argues that hard problems cannot be explained purely through physical or objective brain processes. And here, what we have to focus on is this is a transition question, so we have to focus on logical relationship between the two sentences. So this one, he argues that hard problems cannot be explained solely in terms of objective explanation of the brain. And then the next one, he suggests that there is a subjective aspect of human consciousness that cannot be reduced to purely physical explanations. We have to identify logical relationship of these two sentences to correctly identify what transition would best fit in the blank. The first sentence, hard problems cannot be explained physically. Second sentence, it restates the ideas in simpler terms. Subjective aspects cannot be reduced. So ultimately, the red highlighted sentence is a restatement of the yellow highlighted sentence, making, in other words, the best transition. For example would be used to give a specific example, but no example is being introduced in the red highlighted part, making A incorrect. That said would be indicating a contrast or a concession, but there is no contrast in the red highlight part, so C would be incorrect. Similarly, would indicate a parallel idea being introduced, but this is not a new parallel point. It's just a restatement of the yellow part into a red part. So, in other words, would be the best fit to this question. This is our last question for our sample class. So whenever we have this bullet point question, which is always the question that appears at the very last part of each modules, right? So what I tell my students to do is, number one, instead of reading the passage, read the question first. The student wants to introduce the lover of Alsa Major to an audience unfamiliar with Sergei's Piasecki. Excuse my pronunciation. I have a difficult time pronouncing all these names. So once we are done identifying the points that we have to look for in the question, number one, we want to introduce the lover of Alsa Major. Number two, to an audience unfamiliar with this person. What we do is, instead of reading the bullet points, we jump directly to the answer choices and try to eliminate ones that don't do one or two. So with that, 90% of the times you can successfully eliminate 3 of the 4 options, and there would be rare cases where you would only be able to eliminate 2 options. So in those cases, when you have successfully identified 2 options that do introduce and that do accurately address the points mentioned in the question, that's when you return to the bullet to double check and decipher which options would be ultimately correct. But 90% of the times, you wouldn't have to look at the bullet because you could successfully eliminate 3 options just by looking at the points that you have to address. So let's take a look. A. Sergiusz Piasecki, an influential Polish writer and former criminal, is known for his autobiographical novel, The Lover of Alsa Major, and his involvement in covert intelligence operation. So when we take a look at point 1 and 2, it is introducing who he is. He's an influential Polish writer and also a criminal. So 2 is done, but this is only mentioned as an autobiographical novel and nothing else. And this is mentioned as what he is known for. So this book isn't properly introduced on its own, meaning that point 1 hasn't been accurately addressed, making A incorrect. B, The Lover of Alsa Major is an autobiographical novel that explores the themes of love and its impact on individual, and was written by Sergiusz Piasecki, a renowned interwar Polish writer and former criminal and spy. So if we take a look at this, it is addressing this as a novel that explores the themes of love and its impact on individual, which sounds like a proper introduction to this book. And then it also tells us who he is, that he is a Polish writer, criminal, and spy. So it has successfully addressed both point 1 and 2. So I would keep this. Let's take a look at C, though. Written by Sergiusz Piasecki, The Lover of Alsa Major significantly influenced subsequent Polish literature, despite the author's past as a criminal. So look, for point 1, this doesn't introduce the book. It's just mentioning it. There's no introduction to what this book is. And for point 2, it is mentioning his criminal past, but unlike B, where he is introduced as a renowned interwar Polish writer, it's just only addressing his criminal past. So I would just give this a triangle, which would be not as sufficient as point B. So ultimately, I would cross this out. D, Sergej Piasecki wrote, The Lover of Alpha Major, an autobiographical novel that significantly influenced Polish literature and explores the theme of love and its impact on individuals. So this would be a very good introduction and explanation of this book. So point 1 is addressed, but we know nothing about this person. The fact that he wrote this book is all that is introduced about this author, which is not as enough as what B is doing. So B would be the best option that introduces this book and introduces who this author is to an audience unfamiliar to this author, making B correct. And see, this question was the case where you wouldn't even have to look at the bullet to decide what the right answer is, because you were able to eliminate 3 options just by looking at the points that we have to focus on. So B is the only option that addresses both point 1 and point 2 precisely, making it the correct answer. So this is the end of our sample lecture. Hopefully this has helped you a little bit in understanding what SATs are and what kind of an approach you should take to address each question. I know this isn't enough because this was not the full test, but hopefully through my class, you would have gained a little bit more understanding of how to approach SAT questions. Thank you for listening, and hopefully we will meet sometime soon. Bye.